Hi, my name is Patterson, and today I'm going to be taking you through the foreign policy of Henry VIII. This is mainly aimed at A-level, the AQA history unit, but as a chronology and as a basis some of the reasons behind, there's no reason why it can't be used at other levels as well. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit, or maybe this might just reinforce things that you already know about the foreign policy of Henry VIII. So let's get cracking. The first thing that we really want to look at when we're considering the ins and outs of the policy really is why. What were the purposes behind it and what were the driving ideas? So I've broken down Henry's aims really into 6 different aims. But I also think it would be, as always with history, it would be misleading to present them as all being equal. I mean, 6 aims is absurd. There's definitely one overriding aim, which is, from Henry's point of view, comfortably outranking any of the others. And it's this one at the top. If you have a look, that's the coat of arms for the House Valois, which is Francis the First's house, and it basically represents the French royal family of the time. And that was the purpose of Henry VIII's foreign policy. That was where his instincts led. That was where his desires were, was to have an aggressive, hostile policy towards the French. Remember, when we're talking 16th century and obviously before, this is in terms of territory as well. Now, of course, the English Channel separates us and we're comfortable. As far as I know, there's no great plan to try and retake Calais. But that wasn't the case then. And certainly from Henry's point of view, he has a desire and a belief that England should be taking territory from northern France. And as a marked contrast to the more peaceful, some might say less interesting, foreign policy towards France of his father, he is keen to have a more exciting, patriotic, prestigious, glorious reign, where part of that, of course, is acts of heroism. And nothing could be more English and more heroic than giving the French a bloody nose. Now, on the second tier of aims, we've got one which is linked very closely to that, which is glory. Prestige and glory. Now, part of this comes from the competition that Henry feels, and part of it comes from Henry's own interests and his personal taste. Now, if I take the competition aspect, very early on in the reign of Henry, we get changes in the other 2 leading superpower royal houses of the era. We get Francis I becoming the King of France. I do like that, by the way. Really, if all people could have names that link to their countries, it would make the life of a history teacher and history student much easier. And we have Charles I of Spain. Now, Charles I of Spain obviously becomes doubly important, or you might say 5 times as important, because he also, in 1519, inherits doesn't inherit, becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. So we have 2 other young Renaissance princes, to use the nomenclature of the age, and Henry certainly feels a rivalry. And it's important as well because France is the preeminent power, has been for a long time. Spain is the up-and-coming power, and definitely when you add in the Holy Roman Empire to this, the power of the Habsburgs, and Charles becomes incredibly important and powerful. So by contrast, Henry is the underdog in this trio, but he won't see it that way. The next one is a more prosaic, but certainly very important, which is to protect the borders of England. Now, there can be a tendency when looking at this, particularly as, you know, pretty much everyone, when you talk about invasion in the 16th century, our attention turns to the Armada. But actually, we're talking about the threats from Scotland as well. So incursions, invasions from the north, from Scotland. And you've also, it's not that far, if you look back to Henry VII's reign, we do have the, Perkin Warbeck, Lambert Simnel. We do have examples of foreign miscreants landing on English shores. So this Henry VIII wanting to keep that under control and to protect England's borders is a very sensible and logical aim and purpose. Whether his foreign policy achieves that or not, of course, is something that you are going to go on to be able to decide when you review what actually happened across this period. The next one along there, the hands shaking, is trade. Now, trade is very, very important. In any period of history, of course it is. But for England at this time, still the main income of exports is the cloth trade, and that is trading with the Netherlands and Burgundy. So keeping that ticking over is very, very important. The next one along there, now this is the first and arguably the only where we start to question whether this is Henry alone or whether this might be more of a policy of those advisors and others around him. It represents being seen as a statesman in Europe, being seen as an appropriate, effective monarch in this case. And certainly, as we'll find with this iteration of the statesman, we see the idea of Wolsey looking at Henry VIII as the great peacemaker, the unifier of Europe. That doesn't really sit, and this is one of the reasons why I haven't just laid these out as all equal, because this idea doesn't really sit with Henry's greater aim of a sort of exciting, ambitious approach towards France as being somebody who brings everybody together. So that's certainly one to watch. And the final one, but certainly one which would preoccupied his father and will go on to be the dominant aspect of Henry as his reign moves towards the mid-period, is securing the dynasty through foreign marriage, which is, again, a very safe, very sensible strategy, but as we are going to find, is perhaps not quite so straightforward when it comes to the era of Henry. Okay, now, in order to consider Henry's foreign policy, we want to be able to see the threads across the whole period, but equally I think it's important to consider how there are definitely, in my view, there are really 4 quarters to Henry's period as king. So we're going to have a look at the early period first of all, and his foreign policy during that early period. Building into that, we can see what he does when Thomas Wolsey comes on board. We're going to look at the period up to when we start considering the break with Rome and the massive impact that's going to have on the foreign policy. And then ultimately we can take it towards the back end of Henry's reign. Now, the reason, well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I want to do it that way is I want you, and you can pause this or you can make notes, everything that you as a student would be considering sensible and wise to do to help you understand it. I think it's worth reflecting on how these different purposes of Henry and aims of Henry do fluctuate across the reign, and maybe that can be seen as a reason for some of the inconsistencies that we're going to see in the policy of Henry. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start having a look at what Henry VIII actually does in terms of foreign policy across his reign. Now, a crucial factor for Henry is what can he do? And certainly this, I think, sums up the arrangement, the relationship that develops round about 1514, 1515. And it's certainly the dominant, the most important relationship of the first half of Henry's reign as king. And that's his relationship with Thomas Wolsey. Now, the reason why I've jumped to this here is that, as we're going to see, when we consider Henry's early years, he has the council set up, what has been left to him by his father. And Henry, to an extent, is relaxed about this. He's certainly in no rush to take on all the dull administrative roles that may be expected of a king. But where it starts to come undone is very much around the issue of foreign policy, because Henry wants to operate his own foreign policy, particularly bearing in mind what I have previously said about his feelings towards France. And that's where Wolsey comes in, because Wolsey is the one who backs him on that. Wolsey is the one who steps up to the plate and challenges those expectations of the more conservative members of the ruling council. And from this, Wolsey ends up becoming Henry's de facto chief minister. And that relationship is founded on this very simple premise of supply and demand. Henry makes very clear what he wants the outcome to be. He doesn't want to be involved in the process. He doesn't consider himself an expert. He believes that he's going to empower somebody else, in this case Thomas Wolsey, to deliver what Henry wants. In exchange for that, if Wolsey, who is in effect a fixer, if he can find a way to make it happen, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't matter how he does it, and he will have the protection of Henry VIII whilst he continues to take that approach. Okay? Now, that means that he's got the freedom to approach things as he wants to. That means he's got the protection of the king against those nobles who may have differing ideas. And certainly, as you will hopefully already know about Thomas Wolsey, he was not a popular man. And it also gives Wolsey considerable power. But I think it's important to consider that, unlike the domestic policy, Henry is always interested in foreign policy. So the freedom of action that we might associate Wolsey of having on domestic policy is not going to be quite the same when it comes to foreign policy. And there are clearly potential pitfalls involved. So if we look at the first period of Henry's time as king, we can see that the initial overall thing is as you were. As mentioned before, you've got the council government in place. They're effectively operating almost like a regency council. And they go ahead and they renew the Treaty of Étaples with France. So the central pillar of Henry VII's foreign policy is therefore continuing into his sons. And we also get the long, convoluted marriage eventually is confirmed between Henry and Catherine of Aragon. Okay, so 1509, everything seems absolutely normal. But by the time we get to 1512, we have seen that things have changed. We get the founding of the Holy League against France. This is Ferdinand, as you can see down the bottom there, who is at this stage in charge of Spain. We've got Maximilian, who's a Holy Roman Empire, and you've got Pope Julius II. So this is a holy group against France. So France are being ganged up on for the balance of power. Now, they have an unsuccessful attack on the forces in southwestern France. It seems a bit pointless and certainly seems something which isn't of any great benefit to England. More to the point, of course, it's massively expensive. So the actions of England during this time effectively squanders the money that was left over by Henry VII. So it might seem inconsequential in terms of its achievements, but actually it is going to have a fairly significant impact on what England is subsequently able to do. Henry, not to be deterred, he then goes back again to go for France, and this time he is more successful as far as he's concerned. The capture of Tournai and Terrain is celebrated as a great glorious victory, even if it really wasn't. And there gives an opportunity for Henry to consider this as a period of victory, particularly when whilst in France, the old alliance kicks in and the Scots invade, but the Scots are given a real beating at the Battle of Flodden, which includes the king dying, which means that Scotland itself, given that it's only got a child to become king, really wipes them out for a bit. So in that respect, it's really successful, although there is, from Henry's point of view, a little bit of a sore point possibly in that he wasn't actually part of it. Actually, Catherine of Aragon played an extremely important role, and along with the Candalian archers, of course, the proud town of Kendal, yet again, being integral in protecting England. Really the most fantastic place on God's green earth, Candalian archers. Look them up. Amazing bunch. So 1513 is considered a success by Henry, although again, due to the economic potential damage of it, losing the French pension, objectively, maybe it wasn't quite the triumph that is portrayed by Henry. Then in 1514, we get the beginning of the Wolsey era. Ferdinand and Maximilian make peace with France, which leaves England in that familiar isolated position. Not looking very good, but enter Thomas Wolsey, who, with his skillful diplomacy, he manages to recover their French pension, and he also arranges the betrothal, which means the planned marriage between Princess Mary, Henry VII's youngest daughter, so King Henry's sister, and Louis XII of France. So actually, this period is ending a lot stronger than it was looking just before. And this can be seen as really, again, solidifying the position of Thomas Wolsey as being considered the expert when it comes to delivering on what Henry wants. So moving on to a certainly more turbulent and certainly more significant period, I would say, of 1515 to 1526. Now, this, as mentioned in the introduction when talking about Henry's rivalry and where he saw himself, this is where we get the beginning of the era which defines foreign policy under Henry VIII, because we get Francis I replacing Louis XII as king, and we get Charles I becoming the ruler of Spain, and not long afterwards, in 1519, becoming the Holy Roman Emperor too. James V is the child, so we can kind of ignore him, although there are issues with that, which we're going to come on to. So we get the new young rulers in France and Spain of Francis and Charles, and one of the first things they do is they actually isolate England in the Treaty of Cambrai. So again, we get England as the odd man out in Europe. Shouldn't be a major problem unless you are a king who sees yourself as being the equal of the leaders of France and Spain, and therefore have a burning desire to show that you are as powerful as they are, which is exactly what Henry is. And we get the added confusion and problem of James Stuart, the Duke of Albany, being appointed the Regent of Scotland. Now, a regent, as hopefully you will know, is somebody who is effectively ruling on behalf of an infant, and the Duke of Albany is a French nobleman. So, in effect, you could say that this is almost France ruling Scotland by proxy, which is not a good situation for England to have, as in effect they are the meat in a French sandwich. So, coming on to 1518, again, Wolsey steps up, and Wolsey is the fixer. He invites the main powers of Europe to London, where they agree a treaty of perpetual peace, perpetual meaning constant. Obviously, could never, ever actually work. A bit like, for those of you who are familiar with the foreign policies of the 1920s, the Kellogg-Briand Pact is a similar idea. It's a lovely sentiment, but one which is never going to actually carry any weight. But it does place England again in a positive light in the centre of Europe, and seen as this idea of the peacemaker of Europe, the calm, sensible voice amongst the impetuousness of the French and the Spanish. So it's a really, really positive development, really, for England, and interesting to consider whether it could have been sustained for longer. And this friendship between England and France, which has blossomed as a result of Wolsey's diplomacy, is confirmed as England gives Tournai back, no great loss there. France agrees to therefore provide a pension again for England, and even the Duke of Albany is withdrawn from Scotland, he goes back to France. So no longer is England facing this two-pronged attack from France and Scotland, quite the opposite. We've got the Scots who are basically out of it, they're not concerned now, and you've got France on good terms. So all seems nice. Now, we do have to consider the desire of Henry VIII, and he is never going to be happy in a situation where things are just ticking along without any drama. But also, I think it's worth making the argument, and this is something which I've long had discussions over actually, it is tempting in this period to sort of see Wolsey as the very clever, shrewd statesman, and Henry as a sort of, thick-headed, jock character who is making these wrong-headed judgments. But actually, realistically, if you look across the period, Wolsey's not stupid, Henry's not stupid, and they are fully aware that the Treaty of London hasn't ended war forever. And they're fully aware that just as they have swapped sides in the past and will continue to do so, so will France and Spain. So they know how the game is played. So I think it's important to consider that, because ultimately, when you take a step back, the power that Charles has in this period as the leader of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and we'll see how that power grows as we move on. There is definitely a game to be played in terms of how you balance that power against Charles and how you actually try and benefit from that power. So I think it's important to be wary of simplistic judgments when it comes to this period. So in terms of the prestige, we get the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Now, the Field of the Cloth of Gold is absolutely fantastic entertainment. Brilliant. If you haven't listened to it, listen to it in our time. It's available as a podcast. It's available on the Radio 4 website, where Melvin Bragg and I think Stephen Gunn and some really excellent people, very, very good historians are on there discussing it. And it's incredible. It's, fountains of wine, and they build their own palaces and tents, and there's wrestling, there's all sorts. But it's basically pageantry, and there isn't any great depth behind it. It's a show-off between two leaders. And so it shouldn't really come as a great surprise that this move of England and France on good terms doesn't last. Because in 1521, we get the Treaty of Bruges. Now, this is signed between Henry and Charles against France. This is a scenario that Henry likes the best. Certainly his preference has been to have a closer relationship with Spain as opposed to France, as we know. And this Henry sees as an opportunity not only to see himself as an equal partner, which he definitely isn't, with the Holy Roman Empire, but also it gives him the opportunity, he sees anyway, as being able to attack France and go back to his favourite approach, which is England going to war against the old enemy. So England invades France in 1522 and in 1523, but without any great success. And this is a bit where, again, perhaps a slightly simplistic view, but the impression given, it's hard to shake that Henry has been played by Charles, because Charles wins the victory at the Battle of Pavia. Now, the Battle of Pavia, so far, we haven't really talked about what's going on in Italy because England aren't involved in it. But it is something which you, if you don't already, you need to know about. You need to look at the wars in Italy because it is very much the context against which all of these European diplomatic incidents are built around. So the Battle of Pavia, to summarise it very, very quickly here, the battles that there were over northern Italy and the battles over who is going to have control over the Italian state. And this is where such is the decisiveness of the victory of Charles that he even captures Francis. And he has him in a cage and leads him in a cage as his prisoner. So ultimately it is Spain has won and the Habsburg Empire has won. So they have control. And this is really important because when you consider that, why on earth would Charles have any need or feel any need or loyalty or, honour towards Henry? Because England have done very, very little. But Henry doesn't see it that way. Henry sees it as, right, this is a launch pad. We've helped you. Now you can help us. Let's invade France together. Charles has no interest in that whatsoever. He wants to consolidate his gains in Italy. Now, that might seem very reasonable, but Henry does not see it that way, and maybe he's right not to. Again, very easy to take swift judgments and suggest that this is Henry being very petty, but ultimately, why was he involved in the attacks on France? Why was he supporting Charles if it was not to gain something in return? So either in a fit of pique or a tactical move, depending on your view of Henry. and Wolsey's approach. They support, the Pope puts together an anti-imperial group called the League of Cognac in 1526, and England lends their support to it. So at the end of this period, of the second quarter, if you like, of Henry's foreign policy, we find our hero, we find Henry actually in league with France against Spain. And interestingly, very much on the side of the Pope in this whole scenario, which again is not of a huge surprise. Now, if we move into our third quarter, a bit longer this one, in terms of the breadth of period, because something happens which definitely dominates domestic, foreign, and the rest, which of course is the break from Rome, and of course the annulment, divorce, whatever you want to call it, of Henry and Catherine. But let's focus on foreign policy for now. So in 1527, Charles, well, it just keeps getting better and better for the lad, because he achieves the sack of Rome, where the Pope is, meaning that Charles now has control of the Pope. This becomes very, very significant, or as you know, it becomes very significant in terms of Henry's chances of getting that divorce that he so wants. Now, unsurprisingly, this sparks a feeling throughout the rest of Europe that this is too much power for one person to have. And it would be very easy to characterize the Pope literally as the prisoner of the Spanish, and there being a need to release him or guard against it. So we get the anti-Spanish alliance with France, the Treaty of Amiens. Not really a gesture, I would say, of a great kinship or alliance or working together to any great depth. It's very much just really a recognition of a mutual dislike of how much power Charles has managed to seize in Europe. We also get this time, in an effort to actually put pressure on Charles, Wolsey orchestrates a new embargo. Now, hopefully, you can remember Henry VII, and of course the ill-fated embargo which caused such damage to the English economy that it led to uprisings and the Cornish rebellion. So we get the potential for similar to happen. I think it's a poor move. It's something that you might consider differently about, and that's totally entirely up to you. I think it's a bit of a short-sighted move from Wolsey, perhaps showing that he's lost his fine considered judgments, and he's acting a bit more rash at this stage, because the embargo with Burgundy does no good and it absolutely devastates the English economy. So that's short-lived. But certainly there is the impression at this stage that England is not in the driving seat, and England perhaps is not actually anymore in control of its own destiny. So if we move on to 1529 to 32, we get France and Spain making peace. Now again, ultimately, let's not read too much of this. The Peace of Cambrai, France and Spain, they fall out, they get together, they fall out, they get together. There's never any longevity to it, but obviously it's something that England has to react to, and Henry's reaction is to blame Wolsey for the fact that, again, England is on the fringes. And, this continual roller coaster of England desperately trying to get noticed, trying to be seen as worthy of dining at the top table, so to speak, and then finding herself out on the sidelines, continually occurring. So Wolsey falls from power, and ultimately England ends up in a defensive alliance with France, and we get during this period where Thomas Cromwell comes to the fore, a move to have an alliance with the Schmalkaldic League. Now, the Schmalkaldic League is effectively a group of states in Germany of Lutherans, and it's really, again, a challenge to Charles. They're united against Charles because Charles wants to crush any Lutheranism. I wouldn't read too much into this in terms of England showing any great love for Luther or any switch toward Lutheran ways. Remember, this is the country where Henry has actually written the Sacramentorum in defence of the seven sacraments not that long before. So I wouldn't interpret this too much in terms of religious doctrine, but certainly the League of Schmalkaldic, Schmalkalden, they are hostile to Charles, so is Henry, so why not kind of offer some kind of alliance? But there's mutual mistrust. There's nothing that really comes of it. It's a bit of a footnote rather than evidence of a major switch in policy. Moving on through the 1530s, now foreign policy is not at the forefront of Henry or Cromwell's mind, because they are dealing with the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Succession, the Act of Uniformity. They're dealing with the dissolution of the monasteries, the changes in religious doctrine. So it's fair to say they're quite busy. But you could say that from 1536, at least for a brief period, things look like they are getting a bit more chilled for Henry, because Catherine of Aragon dies and Anne Boleyn is executed. So, Catherine of Aragon's death means that the idea of restoring Catherine as queen is off the table. So that as an incentive for another power to invade or be hostile towards England is gone. And the execution of Anne Boleyn means that, the woman who is blamed for all of this is no longer around either. So ultimately, you could say that reduces the urgency to do something towards England, and as a result of what's happened over Catherine and indeed Anne. Now, France and Spain were at war in 1536, which suits England, but as always, they then get back together at the Treaty of Nice in 1538. So we can see this as being England out in the cold, but I don't really think there's so much a factor, to be honest. But of more significance is the excommunication. Now, excommunication is basically being told that you can't, not only does it tell you you're not going to heaven, you're going to hell, but it's calling on all Catholics around the world to work to remove you from your position. So Pope Paul III excommunication of Henry, in effect, is calling for the Catholic world to unite and remove Henry as the leader of England. So that Treaty of Nice, therefore, becomes potentially a bit more serious, because if France and Spain are on good terms as Catholic nations and the Pope has called for Henry to be removed, there therefore exists the fear that France and Spain will combine, will work together to challenge Henry's supremacy in England. It's never actually shows any signs of happening, but in theory it could have done. So what England has to do is to respond. Now, I'm not saying it's just directly to this, but certainly, and the increasing prominence of men like Thomas Howard means that we're getting a more conservative faction dominating in England, as Cromwell certainly falls from favour. So we get Henry issuing the Act of Six Articles, which can be seen to reduce the pressure on him from abroad, because it's definitely renewing and making it clear that we haven't abandoned Catholicism completely. We do get the brief ill-fated marriage between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, which can be shown as a sign of the significance of England desperately needing an ally. Certainly that's the approach that Thomas Cromwell has, but it doesn't have a major impact overall in England's foreign policy, and partly due to Henry getting fed up with him, but for all kinds of reasons that you will either already know or will be going on to in the not too distant future. Cromwell himself falls from power, which brings us on to the final chapter. Now, what I think is quite interesting about this fourth quarter of Henry's foreign policy is that we are seeing pure, unadulterated Henry. This is 100% him. There is not a Wolsey or Cromwell or even a Thomas More figure influencing, pulling the strings, so to speak. This is all the decisions of the big man, of Henry. So if we look at what he does, it's actually quite revealing that it is clearly Henry calling the shots, because look at the angles he takes. Back to hostility towards France above all else, and back to squabbles with the Scots. So we get the invasion of Scotland and the great victory at the Battle of Solway Moss, which is not dissimilar in that way to the Battle of Flodden, in that it is praised and seen as evidence of the great warrior King Henry. Under the Treaty of Greenwich, which is the peace deal between Scotland and France, there's an agreement that Edward, so Henry's son from Jane Seymour, will be betrothed, so will be legally planned to marry Mary Queen of Scots, which would have been extremely important, as it would have taken away the threat of Scotland and brought a more peaceful bent to those relations. But it ends up getting rejected by Scottish Parliament. Scotland in this period is deeply divided, unsurprisingly, largely along religious lines. So we do see all kinds of difficulties in Scotland. In 1544, then, Henry responds in his typically calm-headed manner and invades Scotland in response to the collapse of the Treaty of Greenwich. We get an alliance with Spain, followed by invasion of France. Again, there's a repetition here in how Henry operates his policy, and significantly, England captures Boulogne, so significant territory in France, now under England's control. Again, great victory, well done, Henry. But there's always going to be a backlash, there's always going to be a response, and that comes in 1545 when Francis sends troops to Scotland to bolster Scotland, and we get the Scottish meeting England at the Battle of Ancrum Moor, and it is the Scots who succeed. Not only that, but we get a French invasion of the Isle of Wight. I know, shocking, outrageous, and really to rub a considerable amount of salt into the gaping wounds of Henry's policy, his pride and joy, the Mary Rose, the boat that he had built in 1509, which first sailed in 1511, which is the symbol of his splendour, sinks in the River Solent down in Portsmouth. So 1545, not a great year. Now, ultimately, that's it, because in 1546, peace is agreed, and that draws to a close Henry VIII's foreign policy. But it is left to add that if we consider the events of 1546 in the context of what's happened just before, it is not a very positive ending for England because of the position that they find themselves in. It had been hugely expensive. Definitely Henry on his own is spending money like it is literally going out of fashion. And we get lots of problems because there's a lack of extraordinary revenue. We get that Parliament is not really supporting what Henry's doing here, possibly because they suspect that he's not going to be around for that much longer, ill health, etc. But what Henry had done to raise funds when he hasn't been able to go just through Parliament is he sells off lots of Crown land and debases the coinage. Now, these actions, particularly the debasement of the coinage, leads to rapid inflation, most of which, certainly the worst effects of that are experienced during the reign of Edward. So, cheers, Dad. Henry ultimately undoes the potential for Edward as king to operate as he wants, although there is the added fact that Edward is a boy, so others were all for him to an extent. But ultimately, I think we could say that what Henry has done here through his determination to carry out his policy come what may is that he lays the foundations of the economic crises which are at the heart of the problems both of Edward's reign and even of Mary's reign. So this is not a period of time which we can just dismiss as, oh, crazy Henry. It has real consequences for who comes after. Now, whether it's success or a failure, I'm not going to give you my views on that. What I would say is that you should read and read widely about it. There's a fantastic article, History Today article by Jez Ross, considering the early period and maybe that actually it was a better policy than people might give it credit for. Please do read into what historians have got to say about Henry's foreign policy, and use it to help you make up your own mind, because as with anything in history, there isn't a wrong or a right answer. It is about what evidence you read, examine, and what you decide to place as more convincing than others. Thank you.